I think we cannot understand the Exodus at all if we don't understand the Sahara. They call it a desert today, of course, but we don't understand that it wasn't a desert at all at the time of Moses. The Sahara area was a completely different land. But yes, the Sahara did dry over time, but it didn't dry in a day, not even in 100 years, but it did dry over time. And it went from completely green like a lot of the rest of Africa to what it is today, but over thousands of years. And I think once we understand this, we'll understand that for 40 years they didn't wander around with their flocks and herds, and its key to this video is about the flocks and herds. Pharaoh let them take their flocks and herds. They did Passover. In all the 40 years that they were out following the law of Moses for 40 years in the wilderness, they had to keep the Passover. They had to keep the feasts and the feast days and the sacrifices. So that meant their flocks and herds were very important to them, and they had to maintain them alive. So of course they couldn't eat them. We're going to get into that in a minute. But yes, they did have flocks and herds with them, and we'll see a scripture. I had two comments that I want to bring into this video as I do this, because great, I love all your comments as always. One good person asked, well, why would they need manna from heaven and all the miracles of the quails if they had enough cattle and sheep that they could have just lived off the animals for 40 years? And that was a great question. The second question the person had, or actually they quoted some scriptures which are excellent, talking about Moses feeding the people fish till the fish came out of their throats. They couldn't eat any more fish, and also having grasslands. So where can we see grasslands and fish? So when we put all these things together, we really need to take a look at the Sahara. Study Lake Chad, study the river systems that flowed all the way to West Africa, from Lake Chad all through what is known today as just the dry Sahara, was not dry in its day. I've mentioned this before, that Trailblack in his video, I'll try to leave a link for it here, and if not, you can go find it. But he shows caves where cave art shows giraffes and gazelles and all the animals that we consider African in these caves. I believe it was in Mali, and now they're part of the full Sahara, where it's just dry desert. But in those days there were grasslands, so the animals could be there for the people to hunt and draw pictures of in these caves. So we're thinking about a very different environment. This is the green Sahara, not the dry brown Sahara of today, the green Sahara. So not the Sinai, not the Levant, which we know is not the real place of the Bible at all. And it's not Palestine, if you want to call it that. They never went through that area. That was Egyptian land, and they didn't settle as neighbors to Egypt on a dry piece of rock with no minerals, no gold, no nothing. They went somewhere great, a great land flowing with milk and honey. But in the time of the 40 years, they had to spend, the Father wanted them to get strong. They had 40 years in the wilderness. It doesn't say it was in the desert. It says it was in the wilderness. The wilderness means, in my opinion, yes, there were animals. Yes, there was grass. Yes, there was water for the people. But what didn't they have? Places for agriculture. There weren't a lot of cities. There weren't a lot of people living there. The land could only support the animals, basically huge grasslands and just small villages, I suppose. It doesn't say whether they ran into people or not, but they certainly did not run into the people like when they went down through, in my opinion, the Sudan area, down into South Sudan, down into Kenya, that area, because that was Canaanite lands, in my opinion. But that was the land flowing with milk and honey. They were living in the intermediate area, in the grasslands. They couldn't support a lot of people, which is why they had to have the manna. Because without the manna, the people could not have lived. Yes, they could have slaughtered all their flocks and herds, and they would have been dead in a few months, because they would have eaten up all their animals, but they didn't. They maintained their herds and their flocks until they went into the land. For new viewers, I'll just very quickly mention the Yam Suf, or Red Sea they call it, but Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds, which means freshwater body. So if they were in Egypt, and I believe up in the upper Nile area, upper Egypt, where Thebes is today, if they left that area, there's only one place that has reeds, and that is the Nile River. There are no lakes, there's no nothing. The only place with reeds, like Moses' basket type reeds, was in the Nile River. So in my opinion, that Moses crossed the Nile River, not with boats. He parted the Nile River which is a huge, huge river, as we know, still is to this day. But he parted that. Pharaoh's army pursued them, and they were wiped out. But that Moses took the people into what we would call the Sudan area. He followed old trade paths that they had in those days, and they went where? They didn't go into the wilderness for 40 years. They went down to see the land they were supposed to take, because Abraham was promised the land of Canaan, because it was Shemite land, and Canaanites were of Ham, and they'd stolen the land. The whole purpose of a big section of the covenant with Abraham was to retake the lands of Shem and to get back the covenant land that belonged to Shem that the Canaanites had taken. And of course, remember that they knew where the land of Canaan was, because Abraham lived among the Canaanites. They kind of knew where it was. But in this video, I don't want to get into the shock of what they found with the giants in the land and all that kind of thing, and turning away and fleeing into the wilderness for 40 years, because they all feared, except for Jacob and Caleb and, of course, Moses and a few others. But the people feared, and they didn't have the faith, and they weren't ready to go in and take on these giants in the land. Tall, Neolithic, or warriors of the time that were, and still are, in that area. Tall, wonderful people. But remember what Pharaoh said to Moses before they left. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said. Flocks and herds. But they took their cattle, their sheep, their goats, all their animals, their, who knows, pigeons, whatever they had, that's what they took. And I'm sure they took seeds and all kinds of other things. And they took gold and silver. We know that because the Egyptians because of fear, gave them all kinds of things to go away with. But I forgot. I didn't even think about this until maybe a month ago. I forgot about the fact that they took flocks and herds. Because when you're looking at the Sinai, and I'll put a couple pictures here, you go like, well, there's no flocks and herds. They couldn't live there for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. They'd be dead, all of them. So not just the water, nothing for them to eat. But I think we have to remember, and I'm going to read the scripture in a minute, but remember that Moses wanted the animals for what? For flocks and herds. For what? Not for daily food, but for worship, for part of their sacrifices, for rituals, feasts, Passover, offerings, those type of things. Remember that if they slaughtered all their animals, which was the question that the viewer had, they would lose their sacrificial system because they wouldn't have the animals for it. You could only take a certain number of animals from a herd to maintain the herd, of course. Back to that woman's question, this is important, I think. If Israel had herds, why didn't they complain about the meat? Why don't you think about it? Why didn't they complain about the meat? I'm going to say 1 million people. I think they said there were 700,000 men of fighting age, which means some seniors, which means some women, which means some children. So probably at least 2 million people. But let's say it's 1 million people. For 1 million people to live off just meat, for a day, a week, a year, but on a daily basis, they would have to slaughter 1,150 cattle per day to feed the million. And they'd have to slaughter 11,000 to 13,000, 14,000, even up to 20,000 sheep or goats per day to feed the people. If they were slaughtering that many animals, they would have had to have had 2 million cattle with them, and they would have had 20 million sheep and goats, just to sustain taking away about 20% of the population all the time, eating that population, which of course isn't even feasible. It doesn't even make any sense. Yes, they had flocks and herds. Yes, they had enough for what they needed them for, but it wasn't for their daily meat, which is why sending in quail was super nice for the people, or when we're talking about the fish in a minute here. But no ancient people in that day carried herds around of that size. We're talking 2 million and 20 million. They didn't have herds and flocks of that size, because no land could feed that size all at one time within a certain area. Okay, the Nile could have done better than they did out in the grasslands. But the only place that could provide food for the flocks was in a green Sahara. That's the only place, unless they took their flocks and herds down to Kenya, South Sudan, down in Ethiopia. Down that way, yes, they could. But they couldn't get into the land because there were mighty cities, mighty warriors, tall people, strong people. The Canaanites were there. So they couldn't go there. So the 40 years they're in the wilderness, they had to survive in the wilderness. And the grasslands were good, but they weren't of the same quality as was down further south in Africa at the time. So God gave them manna from heaven. Why? Because the people couldn't survive without it. As I said, they would have had to slaughter all their animals and they still would have died. And he gave the animals grass and grasslands for 40 years so the animals could survive. And he gave water. Yes, there are a couple water miracles. There absolutely are. But that's in the 40 years of wandering. We hear of 2 or 3 miracles with water. But the manna was daily, except on the Sabbath. So he gave the people and the animals water all the time. That was a constant. The food for the animals was constant. Yes, they probably had to move according to the seasons in that whole belt because of the rains and waters coming and going with the seasons. Yes, I'm sure they did move, and the animals had to move anyway because they would eat up the grass in one area and have to move to the next, to the next, to the next. And in reality, if you think about it, that really is the logic of how you would keep any large group of people in the wilderness. Without the manna, it would have been impossible. With the manna, yes. Even when people went traipsing across the US or wherever back 200 years ago or 150 years ago, they had to bring their food with them. They weren't yes, they could get the odd bison or the odd wild animal that they could kill here and there, but most of their food came with them. They packed it and brought it with them to sustain them for a few months, not for 40 years. For 40 years, they had to have food that was coming in somehow, and the only way they could get food for the humans, because yes, they could have carted off enough food from Egypt to last for 30 days or 60 days, or maybe even 90 days if you think so. Because I'm sure they did have wagons, I'm sure they did have camels, they had oxen, I'm sure they had lots of animals. But did they bring all their food for 40 years? Absolutely couldn't have, not at all. So the food, the only way that the Father could save them was with the manna from heaven. And did the people appreciate it? No, we read that they bitched and complained about the manna from heaven until the Father brought them the quail. And then they were bitching in heaven again, and we'll see what they did with the fish. There's a forgotten clue. This is the other, I'll put up the comment by this other user here as I'm talking. But it's a great scripture that she brought my attention to, and I sure appreciate it. And it's in Numbers 11:22. And it says, this is Moses, shall the flocks and herds be slain for them, for the whining people? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them? Right? So either to get the meat, Moses, the people are complaining as they always were with him. And what did he say? He says, I guess we could kill all the animals and I could give them that, but then we have no animals for our sacrifices. Or should we take the whole sea, let's say the Lake Chad or Mega Lake Chad, and we'll take out all, for 1 million people, that's a lot of fish, right? So yeah, we'll just we'll clean out the whole sea to feed these people. In the day, it's not there anymore, not like it was. There's still underground lakes where Lake Chad was, and where the rivers flow, there's still underground rivers in the Sahara as well. But we're not talking a pond. Lake Chad, look at Lake Victoria. It's larger than all of Israel, just Lake Victoria in Kenya area. It's larger than pretty much the Sinai in Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is huge, but Lake Chad was immense, larger than Lake Superior of today in the Americas. It was the largest lake in the world at the time. When they call it large lakes or bodies of water, they called sea in those days. But the only place that had that with the rivers and this large body of water was this mega Lake Chad or Lake Chad. Lake Chad at the time would have been full of fish. It was fed by rivers. It was capable of feeding millions. Yes, it was. But not if they took all the fish every day, right? Same thing, right? I'm from Canada, the Eastern Canada area. And that's what we did. There were so many fish there when the first explorers came. They would literally ran their ship aground on fish. There were so many fish welling up, they just put baskets down and pulled fish up out of the water. But they allowed the commercial fishermen to go in there, and these huge mega trawlers to go in, and they destroyed it. In a generation, the fish are gone, pretty much. And so the same thing would have happened here. Yes, they could have gone out, built their boats, I suppose, if they could have, and they could have taken every fish out of the lake. But would that still have fed for 40 years? It wouldn't have. They would have just decimated the fish population as well. But there were enough fish to give them sustenance for a time. And so by putting the two things together, because yes, if you take the Sinai as the root, then you could say, yeah, when he was talking about can the sea provide all the fish, then you could say, well, the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea, yes, that we could. But there was no grasslands, so you had to have both things together, the sea or the inland sea and the grasslands. Well, the Sinai doesn't have the grasslands, never has, so it's gone from the equation. So then you have to look around. Well, maybe he's talking about the Mediterranean, but they weren't up that far north, I don't believe, at all. Because that farther north you went, you get into Put's land. You get up into the land where Carthage is and people. Well, they didn't go to war with people in their time in the wilderness, which meant they were not up at the Mediterranean. They were not down in the Great Lake region of Africa where there are lakes. So the only lake at the time that would have been there was Lake Chad, and the other lakes that were still there in the area, and the rivers that came especially with the seasonal waters. I have to chuckle at this. And God says, you will eat meat for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. In Numbers 11:20. So God said, okay, I'm going to cause a miracle with the fish, so much so that you guys can't stand the fish anymore. Till it's coming out of your nostrils because you just can't stand it anymore. So this was not meaning that they had daily slaughter of herds. No. Destruction of their economy, their livestock. No, they didn't do that. Loss of all their sacrificial animals. No, they didn't do that. Loss of any Passover animals. No, they didn't do that either. This was a fish miracle until the people couldn't stand it anymore, right? So let's just shove fish down their mouths until they stop complaining. I think that's a chuckle. I get a chuckle because I assume that's what Heavenly Father was thinking. I'll just feed them fish until they can't tell me stop, I can't take it anymore. So a miracle with a sea of fish, a miracle at Lake Chad, or Mega Lake Chad as they call it. So the Sahara, the wilderness, or the Green Sahara, became a boot camp for the people. They refused to go into the land they were given. They refused to keep the covenant and have the faith to take the land, except for Jacob and Caleb. So they were sent out for 40 years until the whole whining generation that loved Egypt and loved all those things. I just finished a video, I'll leave a link here, where they didn't want to leave. We think, oh yeah, they wanted to go on the Exodus. They didn't want to go on the Exodus at all, not even slightly. Yes, because as the miracles happened, they got worse and worse burdens put upon them. But because Pharaoh was refusing what God, he hardened his heart. The scriptures say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. I don't believe that. Pharaoh took care of his own heart, as we all do. But the issue is Pharaoh wouldn't let them go until finally, with his death of his son and all the other firstborn, he relented for a minute. Then, we know the story. But the issue is Egypt had made them slaves, and they were used to being slaves, and they didn't like being slaves per se, but they sure liked the Egyptian society. It'd be like if I were talking, so let's say I'm talking the diaspora, whether it be in the Caribbean islands, and I know I have viewers from there, and lots in the US as well. If you've been living there for 200, 300, 400 years, and let's say just 200 years, you're fully American, or you're fully Jamaican, or you're fully Haitian, or you're fully Brazilian or Canadian. And so the culture the language the food everything you know. And so Moses was saying, yeah, we're going to leave all that behind. Everything that we're going to go out in the wilderness. And the people, of course, we see that how many people were, thousands and tens of thousands were wiped out right at the very beginning because of their whining hearts and their rebellions. But the issue is, it's not easy for us. It's not easy. For me, I've moved to Mexico, and I love Mexico. But do I miss things in my homeland in Canada? Yes, I do. But not enough to go back to the weather. But I love the people of Mexico. But is it my culture? It's not my culture. And though I love the people, and I've got lots of Mexican friends because I speak Spanish. But the issue is, even with being here for many years, am I still knowing their culture? Not really. I know it, but it's not really part of me because I didn't grow up in it. But the same thing, think of the people that left with Moses when they met the Canaanites later on and lived among the Canaanites, the Jebusites and all that kind of thing. Their culture was still Egyptian culture. It's like if I took a bunch of Americans, and I know Americans move over and live in Africa now, some of them do. But when they go over, they meet huge difficulties, a lot of them, because they come over as Americans. Maybe by the color, they are of that original stock, but they are now fully Americans in their way of thinking, in their way of money, in their way of culture, society, beliefs. And so they go over into Africa and they are surprised that they don't fit in. It's like, well, I think it's the same thing here. Even among my viewers, I see people say, yeah, I can recognize another Bantu from another, or a Yoruba, let's say, or Igbo person. Or I can recognize someone from Ethiopia or someone from the Nihilistic people. I can recognize people, I can't probably so much, but Africans, I'm sure, can recognize people from different places. And then if they speak, well, if they have some French or they have some British sounding or they speak this language or that language of the ancient languages, then people kind of know too. But just remember that when Moses was trying to deal with, and the father is saying, I'm going to feed you so many fish, they're going to come out of your gills. He says, I'm going to feed you so many fish that you're going to hate me for all the fish. You're going to say, get rid. I don't want to see another fish in my life. And I think for a lot of people where I'm from, that's why a lot of people don't like fish, because they've had fish all their lives. They prefer to have beef or something else than fish. And I think it's the same thing here. So remember that the father didn't need slaves to take back Canaan. He needed soldiers. And he had one, at least one was a soldier, and that was Moses. Moses knew soldiering and the army and the strategies of war better than any of the Israelites. Absolutely. He was, for what we read in the writings, the apocryphal writings, and also Josephus, Moses was a general, a great general. And so he knew the tactics of war. He knew men. He knew all training and knew all those things. And his father-in-law, Jethro, helped him manage people. But the issue was the people weren't ready to be managed. They weren't warriors. So the 40 years in the wilderness allowed Moses to raise an army. The others that weren't ready, they passed away. They were gone. The people that could come in the land were the people that were ready. There were only two that were ready other than Moses, and that was Joshua and Caleb that we read of. And they could come into the land. Moses, because of another issue, didn't. But Israel did not wander aimlessly for 40 years. This was all preparation. It was like boot camp, as I said. They were being led step by step around a land they didn't know it. Even Moses, the great general, I don't believe he was ever over Lake Chad and all the way over to West Africa, wherever they wandered to, into Niger, Burkina Faso. I have no idea where they wandered to. But I do know, you look at the size of Africa, North Africa, imagine it as a grasslands, and they're wandering from water source to water source, food source, grassland to grassland. Over 40 years, they traveled a lot of distance. And then you look at the Sinai. It's not even 200 miles across. And you think of them doing circles. After a while, they'd get dizzy and fall down from walking around the same place for 40 years. I think it's important for us to remember, in my next video, I'm going to talk more about the going into the land and the spies and all that kind of thing. But remember that when the spies went into the land, after the 40 days, not the 40 years, but this short time, they were supposed to go immediately into the land, but they weren't ready, right? But what did the spies tell the people? Look at this land. I mean, they brought back grapes and fruits and other things, and they remarked on how wonderful the land was, flowing with milk and honey. But they also were scared to death of the cities and the huge warriors, as I mentioned. But the issue is the people in with Moses for 40 years, they knew from the report of the spies, they knew what the land was like, both in a bad way, what they'd have to face conquering the land, but also the beauty of the land, the richness of the land, the agriculture, they're living basically hand to mouth with manna, and they're given this opportunity. They still have this dream of getting into this land that they been promised, and now they're just preparing themselves to get into that land. Remember that milk and honey, as I mentioned in my last video, are ecology, right? They're ecology. Meaning that milk means that cattle have a lot of water, good pasture, the more milk comes with the better the pasture, of course. And honey requires bees. Bees require, they require a place to get pollen, and they require flowers and things that they can pollinate, where they take the nectar from and all that. So the bees also tell us where bees would live. And if we look at the Sinai, and I know that someone chuckled about that, but it's like, can you imagine bees out there? That every bee would be dead, right? Because they'd have nothing to live on, really. I'm sure there's a few places in the whole Sinai. There's a couple places, maybe along the coasts, or where they've got a little irrigation that bees can live. But imagine bees in that environment. When we think of bees, we think of rich lands, because the bees are, again, just like the animals, they populate according to what is there for them to eat or make food from. And it's the same for the bees. So they need the flowers, the grasslands, the herds, the trees, the blossoms, all that kind of thing. So as I said, the spies saw the land. Caleb and Joshua said, we can do it. We can take it. But the other 10 said no. And the 10 were greater than the 2. And the 10 did what? The 10 convinced the hearts of all the people, we can't do this. Forget it. Get out of here. And so Moses couldn't do anything with them. So they had to go out for these 40 years and wander. But they weren't, I know we just think of 40 years wandering around. 40 years is almost a lifetime for a lot of people. And it was for a lot of the people that didn't make it into the promised land. But in those 40 years, do you think Moses, as the general, wasn't training? Of course he was. Of course he was training them and arming them and everything else. He knew what they needed to have. They knew he may not have gone against the Canaanites in battle, but he definitely was with the Cushites and went to battle. So he knew what would have to be required for them to go in and take the land. And it wasn't just walking around a city for 7 days. They had to be armed. They had to be prepared. They had to be hardened. They had to be ready to go into the land. They had to be like Caleb and Joshua. But in order to get more than just one Caleb and one Joshua, Moses needed 40 years to make 1,000,000 Calebs and Joshuas, so that they could go in and fight a very terrible enemy and win, which they did, of course, with the Father's help. Which is what Joshua and Caleb said in the very first. We can do it because God's on our side. Caleb and Joshua said, we will take it. We are able to do it. The Lord is with us. Do not fear the people of the land. And they were the only 2 that believed it. But by the time they came back, 40 years later, there was 1,000,000, let's say, that believed it. They all believed. They were ready. And they did. And they went in and took the land. But the people of Joshua and Caleb's earlier, younger days, when they first got there, what was their desire? Just as Moses had said about the Philistines, I'm not going to take them the way of the Philistines, because they'll want to go back to Egypt. And it was the same thing here. They're saying, let us return to Egypt. Let's go back to the flesh pots. Even if we have to go back to slavery, it's better to go back to slavery in the land where we were than be out here with Moses. They're doing this crazy stuff with Moses, wandering around with this crazy man who thinks he's talked to God, and wandering around for 40 years in the wilderness. And you can imagine, I mean, the women having their children out in the wilderness, it was, I'm sure, a very tough life. And they were used to Egypt. They were used to an easy life, hard in the sense that their position in the society wasn't here. It was way down here. But they still preferred that to being out in the wilderness, and that's why they couldn't go into the land, because they cried, and they panicked, they doubted, and they rebelled. And in our days, as I just put out this video on the second Exodus, I'm going to do another one on the second Exodus, but in this video I just put out about the second Exodus was about their hearts, about this same issue. Are we going to be like the people that came out of Egypt and go, what do we do? Or Lot's wife, just let me go back. I prefer going back to what I knew than going into this strange new world, this strange new thing. So we have to learn to get the heart of Jacob or Joshua, where Joshua said, as we know that famous scripture, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. No matter what happens, if it means wandering around in the wilderness, that's fine too. We'll do whatever it takes. But to get to that position takes great faith and great commitment, great learning, great understanding. And the people weren't ready. They weren't ready for the covenant, to fulfill the covenant of Abraham and take the land. And they weren't ready to live the law of Abraham, or the heart of Abraham, or even the law of Moses. And so they couldn't go in. Here's a link to the last video I just did. And thanks to all of you guys. Really, thanks for watching my videos, and thanks for the comments. Please, please give it a like if you did enjoy the video. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed to the channel and you actually like what I'm putting out. If you don't subscribe. There's no need to. But I appreciate your support of the channel. I appreciate your support for the channel. And thanks for your patience with me, the Gentile, talking about these subjects. But I do love the people, and more than anything, I love the Father and his promises for you and for the people of the world into the future. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.